1920s was a decade of immense economic prosperity. We talked about how there was a huge, increase in all kinds of new consumer products, and the overall standard of living for many Americans increased with all kinds of new modern conveniences and electric appliances, and wages were going up, and there was more leisure time, and all those sorts of things, and how the country experienced economic growth like it never had before throughout the 1920s. But as many of you know, that is soon to be followed by the worst economic catastrophe the United States has ever seen. Recent times have caused this to be brought up multiple times. We keep hearing a lot of comparisons to today's economic struggles to the Great Depression. And there are some ways in which there are plenty of similarities, but plenty of ways in which there are a lot of differences in the ways that this turned out. Similarly, we also heard and continue to hear comparisons to this and the economic downturn that happened in 2008, those kind of things. And in some ways, some of those things were worse, but partly because of changes that were made after the Depression and government reactions to those other, economic crises, we've kind of seen things turn out a little bit differently. But nevertheless, that's not our purpose today to really compare those things, but maybe this will give you a little bit more context when people do make those comparisons to the economic crisis that the United States currently faces due to, the health situation. Give you a little bit more context as to what is it being compared to and things like that. But today, we're first going to focus on, what caused this economic collapse to happen. What were some of the things that were happening or not happening that led to this prolonged period of economic despair? How did we get from what seemed like a very healthy, very vibrant economy to one that, where a quarter of people are out of work and that businesses and banks are failing all over the place? So we saw throughout the 1920s what had been kind of the government's overall attitude and their philosophy toward business and the economy and all of that? Yes.
They wanted to stay kind of like how they used to be, not really involved, but if they were involved, it was mostly to benefit businesses.
Yeah, they had this very much kind of a hands-off approach, but tariffs and things like that to help businesses that are actually encouraging businesses, but they're not wanting to regulate them. They're not regulating antitrust legislation all that much. A lot of very pro-business, industry-friendly kind of policies and so forth. And, they would assume that the prosperity of the 1920s was because of that. And that's not wrong to assume that is part of what caused that industrial growth and so much, because you didn't have a whole lot of government interference and you had a lot of things to help that along. That's what we talked about with Harding. Now, we did not talk about, we skipped over Harding's successor. You should know him from the readings. Who came after Harding? Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge, who also had an attitude of, we leave it alone. We're not going to, force the economy to do one thing or another. We want businesses to be successful, and the way they're going to be successful is by not being interfered with by the government. So that had continued throughout the Coolidge presidency as well. Coolidge decides not to seek a second term. So when we get to the election of 1928, Republicans have been very successful with their economic policy. So it seemed, pretty easy for them to, gain the White House once again, as people, saw them as the reason why, and their policies as the reason why things were going so well. So in the election of 1928, the Republicans, since Coolidge decides not to run again, they are going to nominate Herbert Hoover. So Herbert Hoover runs and will win the election. I didn't even put up his opponent here. Will win the election of 1928. Again, he's a Republican. Hoover has quite a good bit of experience with the economy and the government and the related to the economy. He had led that food administration back during World War I that we talked about. He was in charge of that. He had been in charge of the Department of Commerce, which oversees business, and had been quite successful with it. Had made the Department of Commerce a very vibrant part of the government bureaucracy. He's very supportive of business growth, but not by regulation and not by, a whole lot of government interference. trying to encourage businesses to, in a way, work together, not like combining and all that kind of stuff, but encouraging businesses to sort of share technology, share practices so that everybody could be more successful. Those are some of the things that he generally supported. But because the economy was doing so well, and Republicans are easily going to run on, and Hoover will easily run on this premise of elect me and you get more of the same, more of this economic growth, more of this economic vitality, all those kind of things. Vote me into office and you'll get more of that. So it's no surprise that Hoover wins the presidency actually in a landslide. Huge voter turnout, and Hoover wins quite easily in 1928. And the Republicans in Hoover take credit for all of the economic growth and all of the economic success of the 1920s, all the prosperity. Saying we cut taxes, we've risen tariffs really high so that people are going to buy American-made goods, all of those things, and they weren't entirely wrong about that. And of course, that sweeps Hoover into the White House. And all this is seen as, a vindication of Republican policies, and that things are going to continue. Good times are going to continue. All this economic, prosperity that we have been experiencing is just going to keep going. The future couldn't be brighter. It's kind of the notion not only that Hoover has, but really the whole country has at this particular point. Of course, we know that is not going to be the case. So few people, no one could have foreseen the economic catastrophe that was coming. And there was just a great, great misconception that all of that economic growth is going to continue forever. Ever since the beginning of time, economies, they rise and they fall. There are good times and there are bad times. And there had been depressions, recessions, whatever you want to call them, panics is usually what they get called, plenty of times before. But they had usually been kind of short-lived, relatively speaking. But the prosperity and the continued growth of the 20s had actually convinced a lot of people that was never going to happen again, that we had moved past that, and that economic growth was actually going to continue forever, as crazy as that seems. There were plenty of people, leaders, smart individuals, that really thought that economic growth would continue forever and ever, and they had moved past those days of that cycle of ups and downs that has always seemed to happen. And so there were a lot of warning signs, red flags, things happening that may have indicated that, this wasn't going to last forever. But in these days, that was largely ignored. People either ignored that stuff or really, in many cases, just kind of misunderstood. The whole field of what you would call macroeconomics really did not exist at this point. You had economists, yes, but there really were not the kind of indicators that you have today to measure economic growth, to measure, other kinds of economic indicators. That kind of stuff didn't exist at the time. And so there were warning signs, yes, and there were things that were being ignored. There were things that people just were not looking at that and going, hey, we need to do A, B, and C. But there's also, that something like this had never happened before. And so there was also a lot of things that were just not noticed, and information that wasn't available, and information that they might not have known what to do with even if they had it at that particular time. So there's no single reason why this happened. I don't think there's a single thing that could have prevented it completely. It's a lot of things that all kind of happened together to create this perfect storm. But of course, the beginning of it all, the warning signs had been there for quite some time. Some of them perhaps for years, maybe even decades. Some of the things that eventually led to this have kind of been around and either been unnoticed or ignored or what have you. But the event that signifies the beginning of everything coming literally crashing down, of course, is the stock market crash, which began October 29th, 1929, a day that is also known as Black Tuesday. So that is another nickname for that day. Stock prices throughout the 1920s, of course, had been going up and up and up and up. They had been going incredibly high, recklessly high, now we can see even dangerously high and inaccurately high. They were, because people kept buying and buying and buying. People keep buying and buying and buying something. People want it, want it, want it. What happens to the price? It goes really, really high. And so stock prices have gotten really too high, really more than they really ought to be worth. And you know what they say, what goes up, what must come down. So this is just when the bubble bursts, eventually, the balloon, you blow air into it, eventually pops. And that's what happened right here. So on this day, stock prices started falling. They got so high that investors start backing off a little bit, getting nervous, and they start selling the stock. And when people want to sell something, get rid of it, what happens to the price? It plummets, okay? So the more people sell and sell and sell, the more the price falls. And when those investors and brokers see that price going down, what do they start doing? They start panicking and they start selling more. So instead of just saying, hey, let's wait a minute and see what happens tomorrow or the next week or whatever, panic, and they just, the value just continues to drop and drop and drop. Everybody trying to get rid of what they've got while it's still worth something, before it drops to completely nothing. So it creates this panic. The stock market plummets. It loses millions, maybe even billions. I can't remember the exact statistics. Millions or billions of dollars in one day. It's the largest single drop, in a day there had ever been up until that point. There have actually been bigger drops since then. But at that point, it was unheard of to hear the stock market lose that much. And some people, lost everything. The stock market crash in 1929 does not cause the depression. That is not the cause of it. But it is certainly the indicator that, bad things were afoot. And it is seen as kind of the beginning of it, even though that's not the cause. That in itself was the result of other problems that, like I said, have been brewing for sometimes decades. And then it leads to, other things, characteristics of the Great Depression. But the panic starts to set in and the stocks continue to fall. It's not just on this one day. They continue to fall over the next several weeks. It doesn't hit its bottom for quite some time, but people are continuing to panic as it continues to spiral downward out of control. And some people at this point even still hoping that maybe it's going to rebound. Maybe tomorrow, the next day, the next week, it's going to improve and get better, but it doesn't. It continues to fall and fall and fall. And some people did lose everything, that first day. But for a lot of people, the people that would have been out everything when the stock market crashed were people that had all their money in the stock market, which was some. But the effects of that, how that's going to affect businesses and everybody else and people that had nothing to do with the stock market, that didn't even know what the stock market was, that might take a couple more weeks for that to all trickle down. But we do consider, even though the stock market crash is not the cause of the Great Depression, we do consider that the beginning of what we call the Great Depression. So it definitely showed the flaws in the financial system and sent panic throughout the financial system, which contributes to and shows the beginnings of this Great Depression. And the Great Depression we could define in a lot of ways, but of course it's a massive economic downturn that lasted from 1929 till about 1941, about the beginning of World War II or so. So it's massive economic downturn, characterized by numerous is too not strong enough a word, but massive business failures, bank failures, unemployment, and extreme poverty of the nation and extreme poverty of a lot of people thrown into poverty because of this depression. So prolonged unemployment, and this goes on, like I said, for more than a decade, this Great Depression. 1929 till somewhere around 40 or 41. Depressions are hard. I think we throw that word depression around all the time. These people love to throw the word depression around all the time. Economists don't like that word because it has no technical definition. It's just sort of there. But there is no technical characteristics behind it to say when something is a depression and when it's not. It's not a technical word. So again, economists don't usually like that one, but the news people love it. So you'll hear it all the time from the media. There you are. So as the weeks go on, when when the stock market plummets, and now businesses have no money, invested in them, or a lot of their investment has dried up now because the stock market has collapsed. That means that businesses are going to start failing, and then things sort of cycle out of control from there. So we'll look at some of the characteristics of the depression. Again, unemployment, all those kind of things. Just some things to kind of give you some scope of it. Well, let's talk about what some of those causes were. Again, the stock market crash does not cause it. It just shows that it was beginning and, rattled the confidence in the financial system and gets the ball rolling, causes that kind of snowball effect to get to, when things kind of hit rock bottom. But a lot of the causes were things, again, that had been brewing throughout the 1920s that were either unnoticed or ignored. And some of it even stuff that may have been going on for a lot longer than that might have been unnoticed or ignored. One major cause of the depression may have been uneven distribution of wealth, uneven distribution of income. We have talked about how in the 1920s, wages went up and overall the standard of living improved, and that's not untrue. However, certainly by the time you get to the end of the 20s, you would see that was really quite uneven. What do I mean by it's uneven? Yeah, that increase in income and all of that stuff, that really affected a smaller percentage of people. There were a lot of people that did not experience higher wages, or that may have in the beginning, but then it kind of stagnated as you got on further into the 20s. The majority of the wealth in the country, the majority of the income, was controlled by a small number of people. Much smaller percentage. It was not, in equal proportion. And so with that, that increased purchasing power we talked about, people have more money to buy more stuff. Well, especially as the 20s go on, that's a smaller number of people that are able to do all of that. And so eventually when those people's demand for all those nice new fancy products goes down, and eventually it does, production and consumption they don't keep up with each other, eventually the consumer demand starts to fall because not everybody has that kind of purchasing power. And so then you've got all this stuff out there that nobody wants to buy, and that means are able to buy. And then you have, big losses for businesses, and, that affects everything else. So because that wealth was, kind of concentrated in a smaller group of people, production and consumption, supply and demand simply eventually will not meet in the middle. And you will have a big problem there. Another big problem that had been going on had gotten particularly rampant throughout the 1920s was stock market speculation, or sometimes we might say over speculation of the stock market. Essentially what that sort of means is people sort of just gambling in the stock market a little too much. It's hard to put a technical definition on what's too much, because that's part of what people do. But people just basically kind of gambling with the stock market, trying to buy stock, not so much as a means, so I'm going to buy stock in this company because I really think this company has a great product and I want to share the profits when they make a profit. But I'm going to buy this stock so I can sell it tomorrow and make a profit off of it. Seeing the stock market itself as a way of making income, which plenty of people do, and plenty of people still do that. But people doing that rather excessively, and that's rather recklessly. And that's one of the reasons why those stock prices were going so ridiculously high throughout the 1920s, because people were just buy, sell, trying to make, get rich quick kind of a thing, sort of a get rich quick kind of a scheme almost, if you want to put it that way, without any sort of regulation, without any sort of, things to sort of calm that down. And so that's one of the things that had driven the stock prices really too high. Was that reckless gambling and reckless speculating means you're assuming that it's going to be worth something. You're assuming that the price is going to go up, that the value is going to go up. And that's part of what people do in the stock market. You know, we invest in this company now because I'm going to speculate that 6 months from now it's going to be worth a lot more. That's part of it. That's how it works. But doing it too much creates a problem, or can create a problem. And another thing going along with that to add to this sort of playing too much with the stock market, or kind of being reckless with the stock market, was a lot of what was called buying stock on margin. Excessive buying our stocks being purchased on margin. Buying stock on margin meant only putting down a small down payment. So you weren't buying the whole thing. You were putting down a small down payment on the stock, which, as we know, people were buying a lot of things in the 20s that way, sort of like installments. But with buying stock on margin, what you would do is, okay, I don't have the, let's say, $100 to buy this share. I've got $20. I'm putting down $20. But what I'm doing is I'm banking on the fact that $100 share tomorrow is going to be worth $200. So when I sell the stock, I can pay it off and make some money off of it. So they never really have to pay the principal. It's this idea that I pay a little bit right now, and then when it goes up, when the price goes up, I'll be able to pay off what I owe and make some money off of it. You see, it's sort of again, the gambling thing, which again, that's what people do in the stock market. A lot of people are very, very good at it. But that created a problem because you got a lot of people now that own stock that they haven't fully paid for. And now, okay, I put $20 down on that $100 stock, hoping that I'm gonna, tomorrow it'll be worth $300 or something like that. Well, stock market crashed. Now it's worth $2. I only put down 20. I hope 80, and now it's only worth 2. So you see how that creates a pretty big problem. So then when the prices start to fall, you got people that can't pay those things back. That are in debt now, can't pay off the stock that they purchased, and now owe money on stock that's worthless, if that makes any sense. So you can see how potentially dangerous this whole thing can be, and because people were being rather reckless with it, it created significant, financial panic. So those are the kind of folks that, when the market crashes, they lose everything. They'll lose, everything. They'll lose all their money and be in debt, and have nothing to pay it off with, and stock that's worthless, and all those sorts of things. Similar to that, there's an overuse of credit and just overall overproduction. And those are kind of the same, they're related. They're not the same thing, but they are related to each other. Just like with buying stocks on margin, that's basically like buying stocks on credit. People overall, the American public, simply was overusing credit throughout the 1920s. We talked about how that was kind of the new fad, the new thing. And one of the things that created that consumer economy of the 1920s was people had the option to purchase things in installment plans, and that became more socially acceptable. But, just like anything, you can do that too much. You can get to where you're in over your head with, owing more money than you've got coming in. And that's eventually what happened to a lot of folks, was that they owed more money than they could possibly ever pay back. And then when the, financial system collapses and people lose their jobs or their wages go down, now they don't have, the money to pay back those things. It's just, again, becomes a big cycle. People just overdid it and have bought too much stuff with money that they don't have. And that's also, this credit thing sort of masked a lot of the problems, masked the fact that, you have this uneven distribution of wealth. Overproduction, basically, we talked about how the consumer economy got all these new products, productivity is increased, we got lots of new things. Well, eventually, that reaches a limit too. Eventually, you have produced more than people want, that people can afford to buy. And when people can't buy it, don't want to buy it, prices fall, businesses start taking losses, all that starts to happen. So eventually, like I said, the two things just couldn't keep up with each other, people's power to buy, eventually couldn't keep up with all the production that was taking place. And eventually there's a fallout from that. A lot of that buying on credit kind of masked some of those problems. They didn't see decreased demand. They saw people continuing to buy stuff, even though they're buying it with money they didn't have. Okay? Another problem, and here's one we didn't really discuss too much, but make sure you read about it. We said that, not everybody shared equally in the prosperity of the 1920s. One such group was definitely farmers. Farmers, we know, have been experiencing problems for decades. This really was not new to the 1920s. I think this goes back way decades back. Farmers still struggling with those problems of overproduction and deflation and poverty and debt. That has never gone away. And that is still a problem that they're having. And so that contributes to that uneven distribution of wealth. That means that they don't have that equal purchasing power that some other Americans did. They're not being able to purchase those things and contribute to economic growth in that way. So they'll be especially hard hit. And farmers, part of the reason for that weak farm economy, one of the reasons they were struggling along with a bunch of other people, were government policies. So in some ways, government policy, which helped create the economic success of the 1920s, in some ways also contributes to its demise. I'll start with tariffs, because that contributes to the farmers. The high tariffs that hurt farmers, that's something that farmers had oftentimes stood against because it meant higher prices for them. And there's another way that hurt them I'll get to in just a second. So that had led to them being in a much more economically depressed situation. But really also the whole let business go, just kind of let it happen, don't interfere. That did cause economic success, but it also caused the recklessness. And so there was no regulation of anything. There was no monitoring of this sort of stuff, and granted, in many cases, it wasn't like they were choosing not to enforce regulations. In many cases, there were none to begin with. But there was no intervention to do things to, calm down some of the risky behavior in the stock market. There were no rules against that, and they certainly weren't trying to enforce any rules about risky behavior in the stock market or seeing prices go too high or all that kind of stuff. You just did not have the kind of regulatory forces to monitor those kinds of things and to put those red flags out there and to alert those kind of things. And then what regulations there were, we know they weren't really enforcing a lot of that stuff. And so, the government sort of their inaction or inability to act even, but they probably wouldn't have done it anyway, contributes to sort of this recklessness that allows the 1920s economy to literally go out of control, which is what happens there. The tariffs, again, that also had contributed to a bigger problem that was not really well understood how it related to the United States. So another cause of the Great Depression, because the Great Depression, what we need to realize is it did not just affect the United States. This was worldwide. This eventually was all over the world, the United States and Europe particularly. There were global economic problems that the United States failed to realize or failed to understand how those problems affect the United States, particularly Europe. Remember, Europe in the wake of World War I was economically devastated. Those war reparations that Germany has to pay, we talked about how they were in debt and they couldn't pay the debts off, and the United States was insisting that debts get paid and all this sort of thing. That economic catastrophe in Europe, eventually affected the United States, and there was a failure to realize that or to do anything about it, to recognize that as long as, European countries and other parts of the world were in economic distress, then that was eventually going to bode badly for the United States. Failing to realize that American businesses, have interests all over the world. So, economic problems one place can eventually affect the businesses here. Tariffs, had made this worse. We talked about how the United States continued to raise tariffs throughout the 1920s. And that was devastating to European countries to have tariffs slapped on their goods. Because if they're there's tariffs on their goods, then that means Americans aren't going to buy them, and if Americans aren't going to buy them, those European countries can't pay off debt. It's just a big, big cycle. Furthermore, a lot of European countries, angry over those tariffs, had retaliated with tariffs of their own. They had put tariffs on American goods. And so if they've got tariffs on American goods, what happens to the sale of those American goods? It goes down. So a lot of American products are not being purchased throughout the world. So there was a failure to realize how all those things are interrelated, to realize that any kind of economic trouble in Europe could spread to the United States and be a part of that. So just not understanding how, they were in a global world. It was a global economy, and all that kind of stuff was related to each other. So again, all these things, it's not just one single thing, and it's hard to, you couldn't really say that just one of these caused it. You can certainly make arguments that something caused something more than another. But all of that just created this perfect storm to lead to this massive, massive economic downturn that just pushed people into desperate poverty and into just complete despair. So we want to talk just a little bit about the Depression, but a lot of it really doesn't require too much explanation because, kind of can guess. American probably maybe not can't identify with it because it's certainly probably poverty greater than many of us have ever known. But of course, the Depression leads to huge business failures and unemployment. So when the financial system collapses, that means that all of the capital, the investment for businesses, dries up. And so businesses are going to have to start, they don't have as much capital, they don't have as much money, they're going to have to lay some people off. And when people start, so people are unemployed. Well, now people don't have a job, they don't have any income, so they can't buy stuff. So when they can't buy stuff, what happens to more businesses? More businesses fail, and then those people are out of work. And then you see that it's just a continued cycle. And then when more and more people are out of work, now they can't pay off their loans. They can't pay their mortgages on their house or their land. So what happens? They lose their home, and they're homeless. And then when banks and other financial institutions are not getting payments on those loans, what happens to the banks? They're failing. And that wipes out even more wealth. So businesses are failing all over the place. I'm not going to give you statistics, you can look it up. Unemployment, and it continues to fall. And as the years go on, everybody keeps waiting for this to rebound. Everybody keeps waiting for it to get better because in the past, it always had. You had economic panics before, but they had all kind of rebounded within a couple of months. But this one just kept on going and kept on going, and more people out of work. At its worst, about a quarter, about 25% of American workers were unemployed and no jobs to be had. As bad as things were in 2008 and as bad as things have been in the past 6 months, it has not approached 25%. It's been more like, I think, 10 to 15, which is still pretty darn high and pretty devastating, but not what you had here. People that were college educated, people that had worked for big businesses, people that had, corporate jobs, out of jobs and no jobs to be had. And so, again, about a quarter is where it gets to eventually. Bank failures, mention that as, when people can't pay back their loans, when people can't pay their mortgages, when businesses can't pay off loans to banks, the banks are failing. Thousands of banks failed within the first couple of years of the Depression. I think about 40% of the country's banks disappeared within a few years of the stock market crash. And in these days, if you had done what you're supposed to do and you saved your money, you've been putting your money in your bank account to save for that rainy day, to save for retirement, but the bank went under last week, now what happened? It's gone. Everything's gone. And there was no insurance on that. There was no backup on that. So there were a lot of people that did what they were supposed to do, that maybe didn't gamble their money in the stock market, but lost everything when the bank started failing and there was nothing that could be done. And so when people start seeing the banks fail, then what do other people that have money in the bank start doing? They go grab their money, and then the bank fails for that reason too. So it's just a continued cycle. Everybody continues to panic, and more things start bottoming out. And it just, like I said, continues to get worse. So you have about a quarter of the workforce out of work. You have people being evicted from their homes. And so you have people that are just kind of wandering, that are going from place to place, that are looking for work. young people that are, as they called it, riding the rails, just jumping onto a train car and just going from town to town trying to find some work. A lot of people, I put it here, red lines. Red lines were basically kind of like soup kitchens, that you would see in, and that's what, it's on the next slide. A lot of cities, you would have, soup kitchens. People are homeless, need food, red lines, people wait in line just to get a meal for people that were unemployed to get bread. There were in cities places called flop houses, places for people to stay for the night. Usually folks kind of wandering here or there trying to find some kind of work, a place to stay for the night so they wouldn't have to sleep out on the street. So people relying on charitable institutions and so forth to try to get them by while they look for work. Homelessness, of course, is quite high. People having to leave their children either with relatives, some of them in orphanages. You can hear some stories of people literally selling them because they can't afford to keep them, splitting their families up, doing all sorts of things to try to get by. Here's some people in a food line. And these are, I'm going to mention in a second, a lot of folks basically living in little shanty towns that they erected, which I don't put that up there. I don't think it's Hooverville. Okay. Let me see if I can put it up there. Hold on just a second. Okay. So to add there, instead of homelessness, Hooverville. So for a lot of folks, again, the picture I just showed you a moment ago, this one here, and the one at the top left corner, a lot of people, as they go from city to city or wherever trying to find work, they end up kind of crowding together in these sort of makeshift towns, these sort of makeshift shanty towns, these shacks like these. See how it's just made out of just random pieces of wood and, pieces of scrap metal and all that. It just looks like something out of a third world country. Those were, where poor people and homeless people kind of congregated together in cities like, Chicago or different places, New York, and people called them Hoovervilles. So these are examples of Hoovervilles. Why do you think people call them Hoovervilles? Yeah, President Hooverville blaming him for all this stuff. It's Hoover's fault that all this happened, and calling all that the work of Hoover. So the Hooverville, sometimes people calling like a newspaper a Hoover blanket, because again, blaming him for all of the economic troubles, which, he doesn't deserve all that blame. But that became common to see in a lot of the country cities. So Hoover's reaction to this. So we know he's being blamed for it, so what does he do about it? Hoover is often criticized, obviously, for a lack of action, for not really doing much. And I suppose that's debatable. He doesn't do it a ton. Certainly not what his successor is going to do. But he did do something. And you also have to realize something like this had never happened before. This kind of economic downturn had never happened, not anywhere close to this sort of level. And you also have to remember that Hoover and all the Republicans in power at the time are of the belief that the government shouldn't do too much, that would actually do more harm than it would good. And so he was reluctant to do a lot of direct intervention. He was reluctant to certainly give out, unemployment benefits or provide other kind of benefits to get people through. Just simply did not believe that was the government's purpose, and that would be helpful. Didn't want people to feel like that, or was worried that people would feel like their government had given up on them. To say, well, I guess we'll give you this because you're not good enough to do it yourself. There's very much that whole, American sort of value or that belief in individualism and do it yourself and, make something of yourself and pull yourself up. That kind of attitude was kind of what Hoover, believed in, as a lot of people did, and worried that any kind of direct intervention to help people was going to erode away at that. So Hoover was reluctant to do a lot of things. And again, might worry that it could make it worse. But as the Depression continues over the next couple of years, Hoover does a couple of things that, again, are not incredibly invasive, but a couple of things to try to combat the problems. But a lot of them actually do more to hurt than to help. We mentioned tariffs had been a problem, but that seems to be Republicans' go-to a lot of the time for these sorts of things. So in 1930, he got through Congress a new tariff called the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which is named for the two guys that proposed it. And it was meant to be a small increase in the tariff, like to raise it just a little bit, but it ended up raising it by like a ton. Percentages don't matter, but it becomes one of the largest increases that you had seen throughout the 1920s. And it turns out to be just an economic disaster. It causes Europe to retaliate with tariffs of their own, and it just further hurts international trade, and again, just makes the situation a whole lot worse. So it certainly didn't help anything. Like I said, probably made it worse. And it certainly makes Hoover seem as if he either A, doesn't care, or B, has no clue how to fix it. But so that didn't work very well at all. There were also some other things trying to give loans to businesses, trying to encourage businesses to stay open, trying to encourage businesses to not lay off people, trying to encourage labor, hey, take lower wages, take shorter hours right now. It's not a good time to be, asking for more. Let's just kind of get through the mess, and then we'll worry about those things later. But most of that doesn't happen either. So a lot of, Hoover, I'm not saying he doesn't deserve some blame, but, he and a lot of folks at the time just kind of didn't get it and certainly did not understand how serious this was, and that in order, to move past it, it was going to take much stronger, much swifter government action. Lastly, to further make Hoover appear to be one of the most unpopular people in the world, was his handling of something called the Bonus Army. The Bonus Army was a group of World War I veterans, a lot of them unemployed, obviously, because of the Depression, and they were demanding a bonus payout. Congress had promised a bonus money for these veterans to be paid out, I think about 1945 or something. And these veterans say, hey, with this Depression, and all of us are unemployed, and we fought for our country, and we did all those things, we want this money now. We want it early. So they were demanding that Congress give them that bonus several years early. And so thousands of them go to Washington and camp themselves out in front of the Capitol building, basically making like their own little Hooverville right there in front of the U.S. Capitol, demanding that this bonus be paid. And this sort of standoff goes on for a couple of weeks as they're all just camping out there. It's a public health problem, because you can imagine these, Hoovervilles were not at all sanitary or anything. Congress voted no on the payout, basically saying I don't have the money to do that. And a lot of them went home at that point. A lot of them didn't say, well, darn it, and off they went. But a lot of them didn't. And they're still hanging around there, and then riots break out with some of the veterans that were still demanding that this money be paid. And eventually Hoover felt he had no choice but to send in soldiers, to send in troops to clear them out. And the general that was in charge, which was MacArthur, some of you recognize him for things he'll do later, he was particularly aggressive and came after these veterans with tanks and tear gas, and a couple people got killed. As you can see from this image here, didn't look too good. So when Hoover, even though it was Congress's decision whether or not to pay these people, and they chose not to, when he comes after them with force and then it ends so ugly and so violent, how does this all make Hoover look? What do you mean bad? Why? Yeah, what does it make it look like he thinks about people like these veterans that have their jobs and stuff? He doesn't care. Yeah, he just contributed to the image that Hoover did not care, that he was heartless, made him look kind of cruel, to the point where Hoover really, of all people running for re-election ever, probably had the least shot of winning. Because, again, people blamed him for all of this, saw him as didn't understand it, didn't care, and didn't know what to do about it. And this had been going on for years by the time that he's up for re-election. So, where we'll pick up later this week, Thursday, is the election of 1932, which Hoover doesn't stand a chance. And we will see Franklin Roosevelt be elected, promising something, saying we're going to do something. If that doesn't work, we'll try something else. But we're going to do something to try to fix this and get again and get the economy moving again. All right. Questions on any of that? Hold on just a second.